We think of the crucifixion in terms of the horrible pain and physical suffering, but in Jesus' case, there was infinitely more to it. It was spiritual horror. After Jesus had been arrested in the garden, he was brought before the Jewish ruling council, the Sanhedrin, made up of the priests and the other elders from the various Jewish factions who were the leading men of the nation, about 70 of them. This was like a secret, unauthorized, middle-of-the-night meeting, and they started quizzing Jesus about who he claimed to be. What they were really concerned about is that he had made himself out to be equal with God, that he was the Son of God, and his claims to messiahship. The Jews were, of course, expecting a Messiah, but Jesus had not turned out to be the kind of Messiah they wanted. They were looking for a political leader who would liberate them from Roman oppression, but he turned out to be a humble servant king who was teaching them to love their enemies, pray for them, and forgive those who have offended them, and claimed to be the one who had all authority. He was the Son of God. He would return at the end of time, and he would be the one who ultimately judged the world and everyone in it. He also claimed that he was going to die for the sins of the people at the hands of the religious authorities and then rise again on the third day. So all of these things scandalized the leaders, and the fact that he continued to point out their hypocrisy, their sin, and to do things that went against their traditions, but which weren't biblical truths. They had been plotting for a long time what to do about Jesus and how to get rid of him. They had him arrested. They brought him in for this essentially show trial where they questioned him even without proper witnesses. They brought in witnesses who couldn't agree in their testimony against him, and they quizzed him about, who do you say you are? Are you the King of the Jews? Are you the Son of God? And after this, they said, well, that's it. Blasphemy. He needs to be put to death. They handed him over to the Roman authorities who were governing Judea, to Pilate specifically. Pilate doesn't care about the niceties of the Jewish religion. He wants to maintain Roman order here and the law of the land, which was Roman law. And he says, so what has he done? And they just keep saying, no, we wouldn't bring him here if he hadn't done anything wrong. Crucify him, crucify him. Jesus has a remarkable discussion with Pilate. When Pilate heard him out and he was like, so these are serious charges, and what do you have to say for yourself? He essentially confirmed that he was the Messiah and the king that the Jews had been expecting. And when he said he was here to bring witness to the truth, Pilate basically, in sort of cynical and world-weary fashion, said, what is truth? And eventually he caved to the wishes of the Jewish leaders who were putting incredible political pressure on him, claiming that this man claims to be a king that goes against the rule of Caesar. If you don't crucify him, you are not a friend of Caesar. And Pilate was like, okay, and gave him over. So the Roman soldiers take Jesus. They dress him in a royal purple robe, which was reserved for the emperor and the rulers to mock his claims of kingship. They crammed a sharp crown made out of woven thorns, which would dig into the scalp. They pushed that on his head as his crown, and they bowed down before him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." The irony here, and that Jesus is standing there without retaliation. They are mocking the creator of the universe, the one who holds their life and their breath in his hands, and they're mocking him in mock worship and kneeling before him to make fun of him. Once Jesus is taken out to be crucified, he is crucified between two hardened criminals. A couple of the gospel accounts call them robbers. This was a term that was meant that you were basically robbing Rome. You were robbing social order away from the people and from the Romans. It was reserved for the worst kind of insurgents, revolutionaries, people who were resisting Roman authority through any means, even through violence at times. Crucifixion was one of the most horrific and painful forms of execution that has ever been devised. More than that, the Jews saw it as people who were crucified were cursed by God. And they got this from a portion in the Old Testament law which said that cursed is anyone who is hanged on a tree. And the later New Testament writers point out that Jesus became a curse for us. He bore our curse. He bore the penalty that we deserve for sin, even though he was sinless and perfect and the Son of God. The two thieves went in very different directions. The gospel accounts say that both of them also started joining in the mockery of the crowds around and claiming that if you're the Messiah, save yourself and save us. But Luke points out that later on, in these hours of suffering that all three of them were enduring, one of these men had a change of heart and actually started rebuking his fellow criminal and saying, aren't you afraid of God's judgment? We are suffering this fate because we deserve it. But this man's done nothing wrong. And he turns to Jesus in the most simple, unadorned expression of faith, just saying, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Here's a man who's a very hardened criminal, and in his last minutes or hours of life, he basically says, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus says, I tell you that today you will join me in paradise. You will be with me in eternity. Jesus also does something else marvelous here. From the cross, he speaks down to his mother. Mary is at the foot of the cross, as is John. Now, all of the other disciples had fled, and the women who had followed Jesus and supported his ministry were all there at the foot of the cross. Here's Mary, here's John, and Jesus says, "Behold your mother, behold your son." Among his last breaths, he is pointing his mother to disciple to be cared for. Mary, by this point, is a widow. She's middle-aged. In this society, there were not a lot of prospects for women in this situation. But Jesus, with his last breaths, tells his disciple to be responsible for his mother's well-being and care. From that moment, he took her into his home and cared for her as if it had been his mother. There is a point in the crucifixion where Jesus cries out. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" We think of the crucifixion in terms of the horrible pain and physical suffering and the shame and the abuse that people suffered. But in Jesus' case, there was infinitely more to it. It was the spiritual horror of being separated from his Father. Again, the glory and the love that they had shared in Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, from all eternity and into all eternity, before they'd ever created the universe and the world and the cosmos. And for the first and only time, there would be a separation. This would be the price of our salvation, is that God the Father would turn his back on his Son during that time and pour out his righteous wrath for our sin. That Jesus would encounter the separation that we deserved because of our sin on our behalf, so that we could be made his children, his daughters and his sons, through what Jesus was accomplishing on the cross. And after he breathed his last, he committed his spirit back to his Father, and he was taken from the cross by a couple of men who were his followers, but secretly up to this point. They were both members of the Sanhedrin who didn't agree to Jesus being killed, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. They were both well-off Jewish men, but secretly disciples of Jesus. They asked Pilate for the body. They took him and wrapped him in burial cloths and put him in this brand new tomb that Joseph had. It was a big tomb in a cliff with a giant stone that they rolled in front of it, and they put Jesus in there. After Jesus had been crucified and buried, his disciples thought it was all over. They did not understand the promises he'd given them throughout their time together, that he would be betrayed, he would be crucified, buried, and that he would rise again. They assumed this was it. They'd all fled, except for the Apostle John. The women had stayed. Mary Magdalene was always mentioned first among them. It says that Jesus had cast 7 demons out of her at some point, and she'd become a disciple. There were other women, Susanna, Joanna, Salome. They were present throughout everything, and they were there. They stayed by the Lord's side at the cross. They were there when Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus removed Jesus from the cross and wrapped him in burial cloths and anointed his body and took him and put him in Joseph's new tomb. These women saw all this. They were there as part of it. They witnessed it. On resurrection morning, these women came to the tomb to finish the job, essentially, of that hasty burial where the men had taken him to get ready for the Sabbath and had anointed him. Again, these women had the means, and they got a bunch of very expensive spices and perfumes that were required for these very proper means of burial done in Jewish custom at the time. And they were coming basically to the tomb to do that, to pay final honor to their Lord by giving him the proper burial that he deserved. Of course, what happened was a huge surprise and what no one had expected, which was that the massive, colossal stone that covered the entrance of this tomb, which wasn't like a little rock, it was the entire doorway was covered by this stone. It had been sealed with a Roman imperial seal, meaning that anyone who broke it would be charged and condemned under Roman law. There was a cohort of Roman soldiers who were set to guard the tomb at the request of the Jewish authorities because they were worried that some of his disciples might try to come and steal his body and claim that Jesus had risen. So all of this, because they wanted the Jesus story finished, they took all these precautions. When these women showed up, the stone was rolled away. There were 2 angels. One of them was sitting on this stone. The Roman guards it says they were paralyzed with fear. They were quaking with fear. These are hardened soldiers. They're like modern military sergeants in one of the toughest, most dominant armies that there's ever been in the world. And they are terrified. And these women are there. And these angels talk to them and say, "What are you doing here? He is risen. He is not here as he said he would be. And go tell the guys, go tell his disciples that he is risen and he will meet with them in Galilee as he has promised." Meanwhile, there was this beautiful side episode that John records for us, that when these women were there, how this exactly played out, whether Mary came back or Mary was there first, Mary Magdalene, Jesus had a private moment with her, and she was the first person that Jesus, not just the angels, but that Jesus ever appeared to after his resurrection, was Mary Magdalene, this woman who had supported his ministry, faithful as a disciple of his. They didn't quite recognize him at first, and she didn't. And she starts going, "Sir, if you're the gardener, if you've taken his body, can you show me where you've put it so I can finish the burial?" The first word that Jesus speaks after rising is to Mary, and it's just Mary. This personal relationship, this deep friendship between disciple and teacher and rabbi. And she says, "Rabboni," my teacher, in Aramaic. Mary becomes the first person to see Jesus risen. She, along with the other women, tells the guys, "He's risen." The guys didn't believe them. They actually said that they thought that the women were talking nonsense, and they didn't believe them. If you want to make up a story about risen Messiah that isn't true, you would not try to corroborate it through the testimony of women in that day and age, because what the disciples were doing was pretty standard. Women's testimony was not acceptable in court as evidence. The fact that Jesus appeared to Mary and to these other women, and they were his first witnesses of his resurrection. This is not the kind of story you would tell if you were making this up. And we have this fascinating story that Luke records about these two disciples who aren't two of inner circle guys. They're not two of the apostles. They're just two other disciples. One of them is named Cleopas. The other one is unidentified. These guys are walking out of Jerusalem. They're going to a little town called Emmaus, and they're talking among themselves. They are disciples, and they're like everyone. They're like, what had happened. Jesus had been crucified and buried. And then Jesus comes up, the risen Jesus comes up and joins these guys as they're walking. And there's this warm kind of intimacy and sort of humor in this entire exchange, which Luke describes for us in detail. They're walking along. People would travel, and they just, this guy, they don't recognize him, right? This is, his identity's hidden. It's just a fellow traveler on the road. And he's like, "What are you guys talking about?" And they essentially pull the old, "Are you the only person in Jerusalem who doesn't know about the things that have been going on?" And Jesus goes, "What things?" And then the floodgates open, and these guys start telling him this whole thing about, Jesus from Nazareth, who was a prophet and did miracles, and we thought he was the Messiah, but the authorities arrested him and crucified him, and we buried him. And a bunch of our women came to us and started telling us that he'd risen, but we thought they were talking nonsense. Jesus rebukes them gently, or perhaps not super gently, but, foolish ones and slow to believe what the scriptures say, that the Messiah had to suffer and rise. He keeps going with them. They stay because they're in Emmaus. It's late. He stays with them to have a meal. This is proper hospitality. In him breaking the bread and giving thanks, they recognized that it was Jesus. He immediately left their presence. It sounds like from miraculous means Jesus in his resurrected form would just show up and not be there, not just gradually. He did come up beside them to walk gradually, but then he was taken from them. And meanwhile, he had been explaining to them all the scriptures that pertain to him, from all the Old Testament scriptures that these Jews would have known that really pointed to the Messiah. And they're like, wow. And then they get on the road, this is late, and they go see the disciples who are gathered together, and they tell them what they'd seen. And the disciples are saying same thing. "Yeah, we know too. He's appeared to Peter and he's risen." Meanwhile, these disciples are locked in this upper room where they'd had the Lord's Supper and celebrated that last Passover. They're cowering there. They're afraid of the Roman authorities because they've been identified as associates of this man who'd been crucified. They're terrified of the Jewish authorities who got this done. So there they are. And despite their security measures of a locked door, Jesus appears in their midst and says, "Peace be to you." They get very worried, and they think he's a ghost. They still don't really recognize him, even though he's appeared to the women and appeared to Peter. But yet now at this point, they see and they don't recognize him, but then they do, but then they think he's a ghost. He invites them to come and examine him, to examine his hands, his side, the nail prints, the spear wound, all of that, to see that he is really there, that he is physically there. They can touch him. Luke records this wonderful detail. Luke was a physician. He was an educated man. He was a Gentile doctor, Greek. He gives us this detail that the others don't record, where Jesus, at this point, asked them for food. He said, "Do you have anything to eat here?" And they go, "Well, we have a piece of fish here." They gave it to him, and he just eats it in front of them. This is another piece of conclusive evidence that Jesus was alive. He ate this piece of fish. If he was just a ghost or an apparition or a phantom or something insubstantial, a fish would have just gone through him and flopped onto the floor, and there's no body here, right? But no, he ate it and the fish disappeared and it was in him. This very simple, very elegant demonstration that he was truly alive. He was truly there with his disciples. So the empty tomb, the piece of fish, and what Luke describes as many other convincing, incontrovertible proofs that would come after Easter Sunday. These are there on Easter Sunday, where Jesus appears, shows himself in ways that you could not miss, that he was truly risen. At the same time, just like he did with the two guys going to Emmaus, Luke tells us that he opened the minds of the disciples in the upper room. He gave them his Holy Spirit and gave them understanding and showed them how everything in the Old Testament, the law, the prophets, the Psalms, was ultimately about Jesus. This is what he told them, and he showed them, and he opened their minds to understand it. And he sent them out to proclaim the good news in his name. And so this revelation, the risen Jesus, is what changed them and galvanized them to go out with this message, to declare that the Lord had risen and that forgiveness was available through him, through faith and repentance, trusting in his sacrifice as the payment for our sin. They went out with that message, this handful of men, from their preaching and from their witness, fearlessly going out, even in the face of persecution. And they turned the world upside down. And what was their message? What is the core, the central truth of Christianity on which all of our faith rests and all of our hope rests? It's this message which has been incontrovertibly shown by more historical evidence than anything else in the historical records, that the Lord is risen. The Lord is risen indeed.